Welcome to Bostic Health, where we challenge the business of healthcare and explore bold ideas that drive meaningful change. Each week, we bring you candid conversations with top experts, innovators, and leaders, exploring the latest trends and technologies shaping the future of healthcare. Join us and be part of the conversation in transforming healthcare. This is episode 54 of the Bostic Health podcast. I'm Bradley Bostic. I have an outstanding guest here today to talk about practical artificial intelligence in healthcare and really zeroing in on the fact that you have to make the data work in order for AI to work. Ryan Leurck is my guest, the co-founder and chief analytics officer at Kythera Labs. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
Thank you. Really good to be here with you, Bradley.
And I know we run in a lot of the same circles, being entrepreneurs in the healthcare and health tech space. So I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about here and probably share some of the same traits about you've got to be persistent, because these things in healthcare in particular, they take a while. And I've really enjoyed watching the Kythera story. And I can't wait to hear more about what you're doing here as you've advanced the mission. But before we get into the depths of how do we fix the data problem that is ultimately what's going to unlock the value of AI, I would love to hear some of your background and how do you land in the healthcare space when you're a rocket scientist, a former aerospace systems engineer, and Georgia Tech research faculty member. Like that's a big leap to go from that world into healthcare. Would love to hear how you made that leap.
Yeah, it's just a pretty standard aerospace to healthcare trajectory. Now, I'm an aviation enthusiast. I had the posters on my wall as a kid and always had that interest. And for me, it was a no-brainer. I love math and science. So I went into aerospace engineering in college. I wanted to design airplanes, ended up working my way into a niche where we do complex system of systems design optimization. Worked on several really large engineering systems like the missile defense system, managed a lot of contract research at Georgia Tech, focused on improving that. Technology portfolio analysis and things. I really loved the work, but I discovered that I really loved a lot of the new and emerging technologies and analytics methods, coming out of computer science, the machine learning models, neural networks, things like that, that we were researching how to apply those to designing complex systems. So, leaving there, my career, I worked in a number of industries. I was a consultant for a science technology consulting company and did work in logistics and supply chain and portfolio optimization and a wide number of things. And I'll just keep a long story short and say that ended up in healthcare almost randomly through running into a gentleman named Jeff McDonald, who's my co-founder here and our CEO.
So you were on a path to be Tony Stark, basically, the Iron Man, right? Designing aircraft and flying. Are you a pilot as well?
It's definitely has always been on the list of things to do, but at different times in my life, I couldn't get either the money or the time together at the same point. It's still on the list.
Well, you're a young guy. You have a lot of runway ahead of you. I think you'll probably get it figured out. So let's get into this very important topic. Artificial intelligence is everywhere. It's all people are talking about. In fact, I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal article this week talking about David Sachs as the czar of AI in the White House. And the main angle of the story was he's got 700 some investments, many of which have AI either in the name or in the description. And every single one of these moves that they're making to advance AI directly rises the tide for everybody, including his portfolio. I personally happen to really admire David Sachs and what he's built. And it's kind of fascinating, though, to see this wave of power that's happening with artificial intelligence. Yet so few people really understand what it takes to make AI work. And what I observe is when you talk about AI these days, everybody thinks about, or the general population thinks about ChatGPT. And so they think about basically a new embodiment of search that allows you to ask a question and get an answer. As a side note, I actually co-founded a company in 2005 that did exactly that via text. It was called Cha-Cha. It ultimately did fail as a business, but we grew it to about 30 million monthly unique users, struggled with a couple of facets of the fundamental economic model. I ended up exiting kind of early, and my co-founder continued to run it. But this concept of being able to get an answer instead of a list of results is something that we were doing back in 2005, which is kind of cool. But also, it's just remarkable to see how the technology today with AI is able to give you the information that you're looking for. What we find is that oftentimes AI is not always right, but it always sounds sure. And it actually is very warped in some respects where it'll talk itself into describing something that never actually existed. And I'll give you an example I recently was reading about. There was a woman who was presenting an environmental position for how countries should deploy resources at a very macro level in order to move the needle in the right way as it relates to the environment. She had a family emergency about a month before this presentation she was going to give that was based on all this research, delegated to a team of people she trusted to pull out all the stops to complete this research. She gets to the day before the presentation, reviews what they've actually put together. And as it turns out, they've trusted AI to validate everything, and AI actually
Mm.
made up completely fabricated studies, made up the people who created the studies, like completely
Wow.
fictional, right? And this isn't to tee this up as being an AI naysayer. I am all in every day in all of my companies. This is such an exciting time for all of us that are in the data space, but it's to tee you up for we've got to fix the underlying data and ensure that the certitude is there, or AI will lead us off into the ditch. So that's a good segue for you to talk a bit about what do you see? What's the core mission that you're delivering on? And how are you going about bringing AI to life in an effective way by fixing the data problem?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I mean, Kythera Labs' mission is to reduce the uncertainty in the use of healthcare data, and there's all kinds of sources of that. And the phenomena you're talking about with hallucinations, LLMs, is certainly something that can contribute to the uncertainty if it's just making things up. I think that part of the problem is that as you mentioned, AI is everywhere. You can't go to a conference, and see a talk title that doesn't have AI in it, or a newsletter. It's mentioned constantly. But I think what folks are struggling with is understanding that AI is a really large umbrella. There's all kinds of tools. As a matter of fact, we've seen an evolution of just the term AI itself and what it applies to changing over the last few decades. Quick example, AI, if you go back far enough, I mean, you saw this stuff, some of these core methodologies emerging even in the 50s and 60s when they invented neural networks. They called them perceptrons. But then even through things like, linear regression analysis that we now just call linear regression analysis, or image recognition was a really, really big one, especially in health, and continues to be in healthcare, using machine learning methods to diagnose conditions based on MRI scans and other things. Used to be in all the AI journals, that's what they were talking about. But now, as you point out, AI tends to mean the output of this class of machine learning model called a large language model. And so, first of all, helping people to try to understand what are the bounds around what all of these tools are, and what are the actual use cases, really matters in terms of understanding if you're using the appropriate tool for the task. I firmly believe that at some point in the future, we're going to be talking about whatever the next big tech that's coming out is, and we're going to call the current Chat GPT and other things. We're going to call those large language models. Now they're going to be a little bit less mysterious as everybody absorbs them. But in terms of the data, you're exactly right. These things are trained. All the ones that we work with and interact with on a day-to-day basis, they're trained on huge corpuses of documents. Kind of shorthand it and say they were trained on the whole internet, because basically anything that's out there, they're using.
And just really quick to pause there, when we say trained, it really is, if you think about a person memorizing everything that they consume, if they had a photographic memory and then the ability to just immediately spew it out in a way that was formatted, sounding like it had credibility behind it. But it's anything that gets memorized by one of these models is going to come back out, and the model is going to assume that it's correct, that it's accurate, right? Like the model doesn't have the ability to to like distinguish between something that's fed to it that's complete bullshit and something that's fed to it that's completely accurate. Is that fair?
Yeah, and what blows most people's minds is, it's hard to believe because it feels so interactive, or it feels so realistic when you're interacting with one of these models. But mathematically, all it's doing is pattern recognition, right? It's an extrapolation of the same basic technology that's used to do autocomplete when you're sending a text to somebody, or everybody probably started noticing 5 6 years ago in your email client, it'll try to autocomplete the sentence for you and things, and it's just going on patterns that it has seen in the data that it has been trained on to predict what are the next most likely words that are that should be used here. And when you scale that up orders of magnitude, you get things that can write songs and poems and all of that, and do all the things that are talking about. But you're right. It's really just saying, based on things I've seen, this is kind of a realistic thing to say. And the accuracy is high enough where most of the time it's giving you back answers that make sense and that are trustworthy. But as you point out, corner cases there where it can be complete nonsense.
Well, so moving into the healthcare domain specifically, where it's not just all of the internet, but it's about what is the specific area that you're trying to benefit in? Are you trying to help patients be healthier? Are you trying to help squeeze costs out of an inefficient system? And if you really look at what healthcare data is, it's documentation that allows a provider to code and bill for things. So this data has been organized in such a way that it's not as much about how do I optimize the insight or the signals that give me better context for what's going on and being predictive about a patient to prevent some future issue or any kind of advanced anything. It's been all about, are we getting as much build out the door so that we can get paid for it, which isn't an evil thing to do. We all, like anybody who provides a service or a product, needs to get paid for it. And unfortunately, in some of our portfolio companies, not all clients always understand that, but you know what I'm saying? You need to get paid for your work. And healthcare is no different. But healthcare now is embarking upon this next leg of the journey where this data that's coming from the claims that are used for insurance companies, it's coming from the electronic health record, from lab data. There's all kinds of supply chain related information as well that relates to medical devices that we see. This data is kind of spewed all over the place. And each of these little silos are billing for things, getting paid. That goes into one pot of money within the healthcare system. So there isn't really a motion that's built into the healthcare system today that prepares to leverage this data in a more strategic way using AI. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every organization, they're hearing the messaging, they're getting the urge, the prompting to make your organization AI ready. And what does that even mean, right? Part of the good news is, though, is that if you are um, you know getting the data that you intend to analyze, if you're able to make it easier for humans to use, oftentimes those same things you're doing make it more suitable for an AI to use as well. And you mentioned all the different types of data and their original purposes, and that is really kind of the core starting point, is to understand whether you're in aerospace or you're in finance or you're in healthcare. When you embark upon any analytics project, it's critical that you understand the data that you have that you have to work with, right? Its biases, its collection methods, its original purpose. And in healthcare, there's all kinds of data sets that are out there and have been out there now for 10, 15, and even 20 years, available on the market in some form or fashion. You mentioned claims and EHR records, and more of this stuff is coming online every day. But it is important to remember that all this data is exhaust from other processes, right? Other purposes that it was meant for. So though you look at the data and you look at the data model and you read the descriptions of it, and you think, wow, these are claims. It's 300 million patients across the U.S. And I can see, you think about the things that are on a claim, right? Who was the doctor? Where did the procedure happen? What was the procedure? What were the associated diagnoses? And you look at this and you say, you know, this has to have value for me to figure out What's going on in my market? Who's referring to whom? Where are my patients coming from? They're overserved and underserved markets. And so there is this big promise of what this data contains and how it could be brought to bear for other purposes than it was originally intended. But you do have to watch out for a lot of pitfalls. For example, in the end, a claim or a claim data set, I like to say, is just a big bag of receipts. You found this giant trash bag and it's full of receipts, and you're gonna do the thing where you're trying to piece them all together and tell the story. But there's an entire industry around medical coding. It's very complicated, as you mentioned, right? Trying to be as accurate as they possibly can, and some folks are not trying to be so accurate. That's also something that you would see in the data. But in the end, data quality is primary. Well, so while you're looking at this data and you say, hey, it's got all the elements I need, the big question is how accurate, what's the quality of the data that's entered on each of those records? And at the end of the day, while there might be 100, 120 columns on a claim that seem to give amazing information, there's 12 or 15 that really matter and determine whether somebody's going to get reimbursed for that service or not. So those are the columns that are really scrutinized, and everything else has the potential to lead you astray a little bit. Same is true while I'm on the topic for electronic health records, right? These are meant to put information in front of a doctor when he's sitting with a patient to give him the information that he needs at his fingertips to treat that patient in the best manner possible. And so, there's an awful lot of ways things are recorded in EHR that don't make it easy to analyze. It's not structured data many times. Even the structured components, might not conform to terminology that's real easy for us, in a data system to extract and analyze.
Well, talking about claims as a bag of receipts, I think is a really good metaphor. I hadn't heard that one before. And it drives home the fact that not only is the claim just historical in nature, it's about something that already happened, but it's also not precise in terms of the diagnostic information. So in other words, if let's say I go in to have my physical, which I just recently did, my annual physical, they run all kinds of lab testing. Eventually, some of that gets paid for by my insurance. I pay for some of it through my HSA account. And all of that shows up as a record in the claim that says, I had lab tests done. It doesn't say what my actual lab test result values were, right? And so, how good and helpful is that as it relates to anything that's advanced with patient care? So, with respect to AI, and being able to train models to do something meaningful, I'd like to hit two things really clearly. One is, what is the thing that you see as an opportunity to train the model to do specifically?
Mhm.
Okay. We get the data's messed up. We need to clean it and we need to get more precise data, link it. But then we're training a model to do a thing. What is that thing? And then the other part of this is, how are you, or what is your view on how to create a more open environment wherein this kind of data that has high certitude can be used in these models? Because you also have these barriers that have been brought about by paranoia. Some of it is well founded. Some of it is more like seeing ghosts where there are none. I was just having a conversation with an attorney yesterday about this very issue, where it's like, where do you draw the lines around what can be done with my data as a provider? And I mean, a lot of it, like, people think about HIPAA, which a lot of times doesn't even have anything to do with it, but they don't know that. And so they erect these barriers. So perhaps you could start, though, with what is a really exciting thing that's happening now when the data does get fixed and applied to an AI model?
Yeah, I actually like that you paired those two concepts within the same question. Really, it starts with understanding and being clear about the use cases that we could use some of these models for, right? Apart from the obvious ones that I think are pretty well understood. You're going to use the large language model to make you more efficient in your day-to-day tasks. Reword your emails, do some research for you, format your meeting transcripts, make them searchable and all that. That is a use case where all the security and the privacy things can be remediated pretty easily. But the other class of use case is where I would actually like to have one of these AI assistants help me analyze my internal operational data. And that's where you have a lot of networking constraints. Your IT department might put up big flags. Nothing can leave the firewall. So you have to bring these technologies kind of to the data, so to speak, because the data can't leave. And it's a little bit different. And we're worth a minute or two here just to say that the strength of a large language model is language, right? Does a great job with English, which is kind of all, and other human languages, which is underlying most of those use cases we just talked about. But it's also really good with coding languages. We call them coding languages because they have their own syntax and grammar and things that these large language models can be trained. And so the really exciting use case, from my perspective, is having an AI agent be able to do the work of an analyst within a provider organization and actually go into the data and answer relevant strategy and operations questions as they were an analyst on the team. The reason this is exciting to me is because it addresses one of the critical problems that providers are facing right now, right? Margins are tight across the board. It's an incredibly complicated and regulated environment to be doing business in. And so everybody's trying to stretch dollars as far as they possibly can go. And so most folks recognize that making data-driven decisions can help with optimization of your organization and operations and things. And so most folks have some central capability, whether it's a team of analysts or a data team, or sometimes it's part of the IT, sometimes it's part of strategy. But these folks are it can become a very serious bottleneck because it takes skills to get in and work with this data, especially when the data is really messy and not non-conforming. And so you end up with a situation where somebody from strategy or marketing, they're putting requests in the queue to the analyst team, and maybe waiting a while for those answers. But if we could get an AI agent in there, multiple, right, and we could get some things that are looking at the data and actually pulling accurate answers out, you can really increase that bandwidth and make data-driven decisions accessible to a lot more people within their organization.
So when you look at Kythera's specific focus, are you working with providers to solve these sorts of issues like health systems? Are you working with pharmaceutical manufacturers to solve issues? Which are the main audience for the specific strategies that you're deploying today?
Yeah, well, Kythera is kind of the most recent in a series of startups that the founders have been on together. We started the bread and butter. We were doing analytics as a service on behalf of providers. Using these types of data, discovering the headaches, discovering the quality problems, designing ability to deal with that. These data sets aren't perfect. We addressed that a little bit. I mean, there's quality problems, but there's also missingness. You never have all of the data. And so being able to understand and quantify what's not in the data is just as important as knowing what you do have. So yes, healthcare providers certainly are bread and butter for Kythera. What we're doing as a company now is we're making that technology for processing, cleansing, and then structuring those types of data into a clean data warehouse purpose built for analytics and AI ready. So providers are certainly one of our main segments, but we do also work with biotech and life sciences companies. We have some payer customers. It's anybody that's interested in what the healthcare landscape looks like, that where intelligence about how medicine is being practiced can help them with their business.
Right. I'll give you an example that we see that's really powerful that fits into this bucket of operational efficiency. It's supply chain. So, and this is an HC1 specific example, but the company has for over a decade been optimizing supply chain, managing over $1 billion a year in supply chain spend. And historically, it was a lot of consulting that you would go in, analyze all the contracts, think about all the vendors that a given healthcare system has, and the fact that all of those vendors have different terms, whether or not those terms are being met. It's tough to keep up with that stuff, whether or not you're getting the market best price that you should be getting. And so over time, the HC1 supply chain team, and the solution's called Source IQ, was using a lot of intelligence and some tools, but still a lot of manual consulting. And if you moved forward to today, we now are approaching this with agentic AI, which is just a fancy term for purpose built agents. And I'm saying this for our audience. You obviously understand it, Ryan. But these agents are now constantly combing through all the contracts and all the actual purchasing that's happening, ensuring that the compliance is there with what the terms are. And then at the same time, analyzing how all of this relates to benchmarks for what you should be getting in your supply chain deals and your pricing, and automatically driving the process through another agent to go renegotiate or establish new terms or put a vendor on notice that terms are not being met. So it's like this infinite increase in your ability to stay on top of your supply chain, which, hey, healthcare is nearly $5 trillion now. And people don't think about the fact that it isn't all people getting sick. A lot of it is just all the supplies that come into a healthcare system and how they're utilized or how they're mismanaged. And it's really
Mhm.
generally not because anybody is lazy. It's because there are only so many hours in a day. So that's like a clean agentic AI example where you've got these agents doing these different things. Now, because it's going after a supply issue, it relates to care because you need to make sure that you have the right levels of supplies to provide care, but it's not relating to like a decision that a doctor's making, and I think that's kind of a bright line where when you start stepping into the clinical insight, you have to, I think, tread more lightly and be very mindful of the fact that you're there to power up better delivery of care by the people that are out there, and that we don't run into an issue where people sort of disengage their brains because they just expect the AI to do the work. And I think that's a very big risk. I think fundamentally, the way that AI is currently being deployed in many cases, we've got it upside down and backwards, where you really should have the human doing the more creative, thoughtful work and have the AI models and agents doing more of the grunt work to like tee up the humans. But in many cases, we've got the AI doing what is more of the like creative, human work, and then, turning the human into more of this robot doing things that are less, creative. And I think in healthcare, it's something where there are so many inputs. We're a long way off from some kind of a God model in AI that takes the place of what the providers are able to do and discern. That's my personal view. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I would agree with you at the highest level there in the sense that the logic and the reasoning and the God model as you talked about, we are a long way off of that in my opinion. But when you think about agentic infrastructure or agentic architectures, which sounds like you guys are using in extremely interesting ways. The potential there is almost unlimited, but you have to say when you're using those within your organization, my line of thinking around that is to treat those agents more like you would have, think of them as a graduate research assistant or an intern, right? So if you can put an agent in your org structure, they're not going to be the CTO, right? They're not going to be the decision maker in any way, but they can certainly be used to help get a ton of work done and improve the operational efficiencies. Yes.
Yeah. Well,
And with regard,
go
sorry
ahead.
about that. Just saying, yeah, with regard to the application areas, you're right. It is interesting that a lot of the healthcare use cases that employed machine learning models early on and AI were on some of those very critical types of applications, right? Predicting patient outcomes with while being treated, right? Or doing diagnostics and things, and the bars are very high for performance on that before they consider letting the human out. And I'm not actually aware of any situations where humans are out of the loop yet, even on those applications that are very mature. I saw recently that they just reached a new benchmark with the radiology image processing where it's actually surpassed humans in many cases for being able to correctly identify certain conditions based on off of a read of a scan. But they're never gonna, in my opinion, it'll be a long time before that alone is enough to make a clinical decision.
Yeah, we're seeing some examples that are very laser focused on gaps in care. One example, that another HC1 example, is with respect to anemia. As it turns out, anemia is a very significant risk factor for pregnant women and their babies, and also for people who have surgery. And oftentimes it's overlooked, which is sort of shocking. You would think at this point that would be a very highly addressed health issue, since it's really a matter of either doing an infusion or giving some kind of a supplement. Or ensuring that you're detecting, if there's some underlying issue that's causing the anemia, like internal bleeding. So there's an opportunity that HC1 has is addressing for its health system partners to zero in on the signals and patterns that identify those people who are most likely to be at high risk of having anemia. And if you
Hmm.
identify that, engage them in a care process, make it so they go into surgery and they're not anemic anymore, then they don't have to have a transfusion, which a transfusion is like a liquid organ transplant. It's very risky. It can create all kinds of issues that people don't recognize, that's something you want to avoid if you can. And so that's just a specific example where it's powering up the care delivery to close that gap. And that's the clinical opportunity that we're seeing in our companies, which we've got 3 companies in our Health Cloud Capital portfolio, all of which are applying AI to different issues. But it's not like it's attempting to overcome or replace the caregivers. It's actually helping the caregivers to focus in on those highest risk areas that can be addressed in a relatively straightforward way. And in order to do all of that, as you're pointing out, you've got to have data that isn't a big mess, and it has to be something you can trust. And, it's interesting when you talk about claims, the one aspect of the claims data that tends to be the most specific and current is prescription claims data, because it tells you what the drugs are and it tends to help you understand like what the quantity is that's being prescribed to a given individual. And we've trained a model in our Decision RX company that is able to automatically impute, based on the medications that people are on, what their conditions are and what their risk levels are. So it's like the company doesn't have to have all the EHR data and all the lab data and all that other data. Now, if it has all that other data, it helps raise that level of precision, but data is hard to get access to, right? Like, so I'd love to kind of wrap up with the last topic of, okay, cool, Ryan. If you get the data, you can use your AI to get it set up in such a way that it can provide better analytics, be more predictive, help you train AI models in an effective way. But how do you partner to gain the data that's needed? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So, well, it's a big topic. There are all kinds of organizations, and it surprises many people to know. I mean, we just had Thanksgiving dinner, and talking with family, people are shocked and sometimes concerned that yes, you can go buy massive healthcare claims data sets. That's important to note, and this is what I tell them too, and is that it's all de-identified. There's no way to map it back to a procedure that Ryan Leurck had done someday, some time ago. And the HIPAA and privacy, consumer protection laws, all of those things apply. I'll say in many cases it's more stringent than even working on some classified material that I had my hands on in a past life, right? Um, but yeah, this data is out there. Lots of times you would source through someone that's an aggregator who has built relationships with clearinghouses that are routing the claims. Sometimes it's working with other software vendors that do practice management software or electronic health records that have bundled their data and made it available in very specific ways. And so there's a variety of ways of going out and getting that. I will say sourcing and understanding what you need to buy for your use case is not a trivial process. That's something that we help folks with too, because a large claims data set, may or may not contain the kind of information that you're looking for. If your use case is cardiology and this claim set has a whole bunch of information about orthopedics and gastro. So again, understanding what's missing from a data set is really important. But a lot of times the sourcing is complicated by the fact that if you're a provider, you have a lot of your own internal data. You can see what you've done to the patients and how you've treated them, but you can't see outside your own four walls, so to speak. And so there is still a desire to say, hey, let's take some of these data sets that will give me more longitudinal visibility of these patients that I'm treating, so I can understand where they're coming from, what happened to them before they came to me, and then what happened to them after they left. And did they just stop treatment, or did they go go somewhere else and continue that. Doing the integration of those things opens up an awful lot of use cases that providers don't have. I'll say the situation is a little different on the life sciences side because they're typically in the position where they've already bought all the data that you can buy. And in many cases, they've got claims records 4, 5, 6 times. There's duplicates in their data because if you source it from a provider set or a clearinghouse set or a payer set, you might have the same claim represented in each of those. So deduplication and all of that stuff is a big challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree. And part of it is I think we're still in the early innings of this new data era, which it doesn't feel like it because we've been talking about these things for quite a while, decades really. But with the emergence of the advanced AI models and the compute that you can leverage and just how fast that's changing, you talk about Moore's law, where every 12 to 18 months computing power in the processor would double while the cost would get cut in half. That is even faster in the age of AI. It's truly is like testing laws of physics related to the amount of power that you can bring to bear to drive all of the energy needed to make all this come to life. But it's definitely a situation where we're in this like new frontier where there's this new wave of power. And because healthcare is so critical to our overall society, it's not just a nice to have thing. It's not like payday loans or something. Like this thing is, we all need it. Our friends and family benefit from this and it's important. But the other part is it's nearly $5 trillion, which is unsustainable. And so the people have struggled for a long time with how is that going to get rectified? And it's absolutely the case that AI is going to rectify that. Now, does it take like a net new re-envisioned healthcare system from the ground up in order to make that future become true? Or is it the case that we can take existing healthcare systems and existing life sciences approaches and medical device companies and re-engineer them to help them be sort of reimagined and rebuilt, which is tough. I think even as a software company, and this, you built multiple companies and have seen a lot of technology, it's in many cases easier to start from scratch, especially in the age of AI, than it is to try to re-engineer an existing system and an existing model to take advantage of these new tools. Cloud native was the thing 15 years ago that was pretty novel in healthcare. Now it's AI native is emerging. But if I had to take my crystal ball, my true belief is that as the healthcare establishment starts to see actual implementations of AI driven capability and agentic capability that takes out people from the process and reallocates them, or if they're low value, they can find a different career path. But that is going to be a massive shift over the next 10 years. And I think we're going to find that the service levels end up going way, way up because you're going to have like really thoughtful agentic approaches to how you match the supply and demand. You're going to have more telemedicine opportunities that'll allow you to access subspecialized care anywhere in the world. And AI is going to help make that be the case. And you're going to have a situation where people do start living longer. And ultimately our overall economy, you asked the question of how does GDP continue to grow like it has? We just found our answer, right? Like when you look at, we're now building companies that can grow twice as fast at a fifth of the cost because of all of this agentic capability. So I think once you see it, but until you see it, you think it's just ChatGPT. But once you see it and you're like, I'll offer one more example and then we'll wrap up here with your closing comments, Ryan. But there's this amazing example that A16Z shared where one of their portfolio companies, Happy Robot, which is a agentic voice AI service company, they power a trucking company that books different freight for people that they need to move freight around. And in this example that they played, this demo, there's this individual who calls in to find out what it's going to cost to move a load from one place to the other. And this agent answers, very friendly female voice. I had the very normal like pauses and even a little bit of verbal noise. So it didn't sound at all like a machine. And she literally negotiates, the AI agent negotiates the deal. to the satisfaction of the customer. This is not like a fictional demo. It was real. And guess what? That AI agent will never get tired, will never get upset. If the customer isn't willing to pay the price that they're saying it's going to be, they'll stay within the boundaries of what they're allowed to offer. It's those kinds of examples, when you see them come to life in the wild, it makes you realize, like, this changes everything. This isn't just like an incremental step. Like, this is bigger than the advent of the browser, which was pretty fucking big. It led to, you know, Amazon and e-commerce, but now it's like this next thing that is just so exciting. So Ryan, would love to hear your thoughts, just as a visionary, on where this is going, and how big you think this is for healthcare and really the economy in general.
It's interesting because you mentioned the internet boom, the 90s and the .com and all of that, and the transformation that we've seen in just I'm a millennial, so I remember distinctly life before everything was on the internet. And in just that short time, you almost can't imagine life without the internet, how much
Yeah,
it's
remember when you
changed.
didn't have a cell phone?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like my kids, they can't comprehend it, but
Try to explain
it'll
to them what a
be.
pay, try to explain to your kids what a payphone is.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sorry to
Got that
interrupt. Go
question
ahead.
before. They see it. They see it on TV. I've got that question. It will be very interesting to see in another 10 to 20 years time if we interpret this big buildup and this big boom that we so far have thought was the biggest revolution, in human lifestyle, as just the setting the stage for what the real big boom and revolution will be, and that is AI. This may have all just been, the preparation and enabler, technology enabler for what really is going to change things in ways we can't even imagine. But I think it's going to come in both flavors that you mentioned, particularly in healthcare. Right? There may be some brand new business models that emerge that just weren't possible to do before you had kind of that AI in the workforce. But I think you will, for quite a bit of time, also just see continued optimization of organizations and practices that are currently in place. There's certainly so many very practical use cases that people can implement right now to improve their business and their operations, for sure.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Well, companies like Kythera and entrepreneurs like you are making it happen. And there's never been a better time to be in your seat, Ryan. So excited to continue to have this conversation on an ongoing basis, and really appreciate you being here on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely, Bradley. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. We all have our reasons for being involved in healthcare. I'm convinced, everybody knows someone that could benefit from a healthcare organization or industry that is more efficient. So, finances and all of that. Yes, it's super important. We have to make sure this is sustainable, but also just improvement of care. You gotta value that and realize that, yeah, this is going to move the needle for sure.
Awesome. Well, let's make it happen, brother. Well, hey, thank you everybody for being here for another episode of Bostic Health. I'm your host, Bradley Bostic, wrapping up episode 54. We'll see you next week.